Okay.
And you can use those slides up there, or you can.
Sorry about this, guys. It's a new one for me.
There you go.
Alrighty. Good afternoon, everyone. Like Sarah said, I'm Tony Cook. I'm with Decision Sports Center, PA&E, and want to give you an overview of PMPM. And one thing is we have some new information on methodology that we switched to. So even if you've seen the PMPM brief before, those of you that have probably are going to gain some new information as well. Okay.
We're hoping to minimize that echo.
These are the course goals. They went out in the email as well. By the end of the course, you should be able to describe the origin of the per capita cost calculation, discuss the purpose of it, understand how PMPM relates to OTSG and TMA strategic goals, the so what of it. Also understand the basics of the PMPM calculation. We won't go into great detail on that. The analysts will have another follow-on course that will talk about that and actually do some hands-on. And then finally, identify methods for reducing the PMPM values. This is outlined. The purpose is to give you an overview of the concepts, components, calculations, and drivers of PMPM. So what we're going to do is give a quick description of what PMPM is. PMPM in the grand scheme, that's the so what. The calculation will start out with the very basic calculation, then the key terms, what the components are that go into the calculation, and finally expand that calculation to show you how those fit into the overall final product. Then I'm going to show you some information on how to do a deep dive analysis. A lot of times people are asking me how exactly do we get to what's driving the PMPM. Well, this is the type of analysis that I do in order to get to the bottom of what part of PMPM, whether it be cost, population, whatnot, is driving it. Then I look at some of the drivers of PMPM way ahead, and I also added a final one that some next steps for the group to do after they get finished with this course. Okay, what is PMPM? It's basically a measure that reflects it's the average cost to provide care to an enrollee beneficiary. It measures more importantly than that. I mean, that just gives you an overview. Most people realize that by per member per month. But one of the most important things is to understand that it's not really how you're managing your resources, but rather such as budget, internal resources, but how effectively you're managing the enrollee's care. And it's important to remember this because a lot of times people want to look just at their own internal budget and internal use, but it expands far beyond that, including other MTFs that give you your enrollee's care. Where it came from? Well, it was created by Health Affairs as a response to first Congress, and then they passed the DOD with a question of how much is it costing us to provide care to those enrolled population of DOD. And they came up with the PMPM, they being Health Budget and Financial Policy over Health Affairs. It can be measured at the MHS or service level, and that's where Health Affairs usually finishes. But what we've done, we've been able to enable the users to look down to the region or MTF level. And this is an important part. Right now, we can only go down to the parent level. In most cases, there are some child MTFs that we can look at, but any lower than that, it gets really messy, if you will. It can be measured by month, quarter, or year. Typically, we like to look at quarter, and typically we compare a quarter of the past year to the quarter of this year, first quarter to first quarter top. It can be measured as an aggregate or a rolling average. Any different ways to look at it. But the most important thing to remember is that you're looking at it not as a single point in time, but as a trend, and whether or not you're improving it. Also, another important thing to remember is it's always going to be 60 to 90 days behind. Those of you that deal with MEPRS data realize that the MEPRS data isn't available in M2 until 60 days after the closeout. MTS have 45 days, and you have to have 15 more days on that to get into M2. And then the 90 days is really your purchase care data. Some people say that's even too close to trust it, but we usually do it at 90. That way we can do it every quarter and update and have a good number. Okay, this is a build typically, but I'll just give you an idea of what it is. This is a standard slide that's used in a lot of the CBOS training that we do. Colonel Swafford asked us to add it in, and it tells you going from left to right. You know, you go from the population through the system of health, and at the other end, you come out with the poor force, healthy families, and whatnot. Well, where does PMPM fit into that? If you look in the bottom left corner, there's a purple circle. That's PMPM that falls under the capacity, but it can also fit, as the arrow indicates, under efficiency and effectiveness. There's pieces of it all over this photo, if you will. Starting with the left, the population, which is the denominator, is measured in equivalent lives, and then the cost, which is the numerator, minus dental, is the other piece of the PMPM. So that's a start of where PMPM fits in. Now, going on to the so what, well, it's a key component of the quadruple aim. If you see in the right-hand corner, lower right-hand corner, per capita cost. Now, there are there are several other metrics that are used for per capita cost, but PMPM is an overall look at per capita cost. It also is part of the MHS Annual Performance Report Card. Now, this is what goes up to the Secretary of Defense as a report from HATMA. And if you look down in the highlighted per capita cost, under it is the annual percent increase in per capita costs, which is basically PMPM. It's measured a little bit differently as it goes forward. Everybody wants to look at it in a little different way, but it's the same metric, basically. And finally, the so what, it is one of the metrics in the Army Strategic Management System, which is looked at Big Army. And if you want to look that up in the SMS, it's, as you can read there, it's 4.1.1-2M. And right now, if you go in and look at it, you'll see a flat line. And the reason for that is that we have just now finished up developing and building the new PMPM using the methodology that no longer uses APGs. Any questions? Am I getting any?
Just with the DCO, but we're fixing those, so
okay.
You're good with content.
Okay. Okay, on to the calculation. This is the basic calculation. And the reason I've separated out the direct care outpatient costs and inpatient costs is that they are calculated costs. They aren't straight from a system. You have to do several calculations to get to those. So you add those two to the pharmacy costs and then to the purchase care inpatient outpatient costs, and you divide it by the equivalent lives, which is your population, represents your enrolled population. Okay, some key terms that we want to look at. First of all is equivalent lives. A lot of people question on this because it's not a straight enrollee number, but if you can imagine that the average patient in usage, based on usage of the system, is a 1, and then you break out that same population by age, gender, and BNCAT, and there's a table that they have developed at Health Affairs back in, well, it's been 10 years ago, 2001. And whichever side, based on that usage you fall, it can go anywhere from like a 0.3 up to a 6.3, let's say. And usually you have the younger population, of course, on the lower side and the older population on the top side, as well as women in their childbearing years. There's many different things that were added into this calculation. The important thing to realize about this is that the equivalent lives is really a demographic factor. If you look at a site such as Fort Hood, you're going to have typically lower equivalent lives. And you say, well, why you have all these active duty soldiers? Well, they, in the current equivalent lives table, have a lower equivalent life value than the older population because the 18 to 24-year-old active duty male at the time this was done was the healthiest of the population. This is being fixed, and I'll talk about this later. There's something in in the works right now to actually risk adjust for certain members of the population. The unit cost is a really important concept to understand because it's what drives the direct care cost. Basically what it is, it's the cost per weighted workload, whether it be RWPs or RVUs, by location where the care is provided. So each MTF in the whole MHS, you have to calculate a cost per first on inpatient, outpatient, and the 2 ancillaries. And that's a new one. Some of you that are familiar with the calculation know that we have not done that before, but are now. And one of the important parts about this, and I don't know if Sarah's had a chance to put out there, we're going to ask before we do our next DCO that you come to the table and we know what percentage of you has what level of M2 access. And the reason that's important is because, once again, you have to be able to pull every MTF, their data, every MTF in the inventory. So it's Air Force, Navy, it doesn't matter which ones, they have to be able to go into this calculation. Then utilization is basically the amount of care that's provided to enrollees, but it also can be the amount of care that's provided to the non-enrollees. And that's the reason I say that is because in the unit costs, you count everybody that comes through the door. In the actual PMPM calculation for equivalent lives, you're only counting the enrollees in that. And then finally, this may be a new term to most of you. It's called a super RVU developed by Health Affairs. And it is the provider or aggregate RVUs plus the APCs measured as RVUs. There's a factor that converts APCs to RVUs, and it's been vetted. It is not, how do I say? It comes as close to the old PMPM as possible with changing the methodology entirely. So we've all looked at it, and it looks to be good, and I can explain more to that to any of you that want to know about it. Just add that to the list. Okay, the calculation components. The direct care, institutional, inpatient, or professional, outpatient. The inpatient is measured in RWPs and outpatient in super RVUs. Then now we have the direct care radiology and lab that are their RVUs. They're populated well enough now that we can use them. And then the inpatient, outpatient expenses that comes into calculating the cost per is MEPRs A and B, and it's straight A and B. We don't go down below the first level MEPRs when we pull those expenses. A quick note down at the bottom, the inpatient is pretty much the way it's always been, the labor plus non-labor expenses, and the non-labor is a 12-month rolling average. And if they're A codes, it equals the total expenses minus labor and depreciation. That's for your non-labor expenses. Then you add that back into the labor to get your adjusted expenses. In the past, we've done the same thing with the outpatient, but because of the ancillaries not having labor costs separately, we can't really take those out and add them back in. So until we get the ease access and are able to do that, we're simply taking the total expenses and taking out depreciation as well as ancillaries, which is rad, lab, and pharmacy. So you take all those together, and here's the basic calculation again, only expanded. And this takes you step by step in direct patient, outpatient cost. You first come up with a cost per super RVU or RVU, and that's for ancillaries. It's derived by dividing the outpatient expenses of location by the total RVUs that are generated at that location. So you may have a place such as Travis Air Force Base that has a cost per RVU of $130, and then Rutgers may have $80. But each one place has a separate cost per that's used in the final calculation of the outpatient cost. And what you do there is you take the number of RVUs, two different types, provided to your enrollees, and it's multiplied by the cost per RVU of the location where the care was provided. And this is duplicated in the direct care inpatient cost, only using the cost per RWP. So those two, once again, are added to the pharmacy costs, which are pulled directly from the database. and then that's added to the purchase care inpatient and outpatient cost. Real quick note on the pharmacy cost, that has a correction that has been made. It may not be in, if you see in the HA numbers, it may not be in this first iteration, but they're making an adjustment. They have always used the amount allowed for the retail and TMOP pharmacy cost instead of the amount paid. And they didn't think it was that big a difference, but we ran some numbers and showed it to them, and they're making that correction. So it will be the amount paid, which that's the same as what they're pulling for the purchase care inpatient and outpatient. And once again, you divide that numerator with those all added together by the number of equivalent lives to get the cost per member. Okay, I put this one up front because we're about to look at some drivers, and I wanted to show you how we go about looking at the causes, if you will, or what's driving PMPM. Well, Fort Anywhere here you can see has not a very sharp upward trend, but they are trending upward. And ignore the last 2 quarters because the data is not in for those when I pull these out. What I do is I first take the PMPM, and then I pull out the outpatient versus inpatient total. So you have your purchase care and direct care in those outpatient and inpatient costs. Well, as you can see, there's a very striking correlation between the outpatient costs and the rise in PMPM. So my next step is to take those outpatient costs and take a look and see whether or not it's direct care or purchase care. And once again, here you can see a pretty good correlation between the direct care cost and the outpatient cost as a total. Now, what you do from here, and it's you know, whichever one you find is doing that, you can also do this for equivalent lives to take a look to see if you have a drop in equivalent lives or upward swing that may be causing your PMPM to fluctuate. Then you would dive deeper into the data and take a look at, like in this case, the outpatient cost for direct care seem to be driving, would be the major driver. You'd want to look at both the cost per APG and the cost and the utilization by your enrollees. Now, most of the places, I know that I go on and on about you're counting everywhere that your enrollees have care, and that includes purchase care. So there's a lot of it that you can't regulate. But most places will have most of their care for the enrollees done in their facility. So your cost per RVU and cost per RWP are very important to look at. So from this point, you take a look at the utilization and cost, and if the cost per APG is on a steady slope, but your utilization is going up, then you know that that's what's driving it. And then you find out what's causing that utilization to go up and go from there and form a course of action. Now, this can be tedious because there can be more than one drivers. I have found that in the expense data, some places will have a sharp upward trend of civilian labor, and some have a sharp upward trend of non-labor expenses. And of course, you know about different things that have gone on in the last couple of years with the growth of the Army, where we've hired a lot of civilians, and we've also put a lot of funds into SRM. And SRM is part of this, not Milcom, but SRM is part of the calculation.
Can you define SRM?
SRM is why did you have to ask that question? It has to do with the maintenance of the building. The M is maintenance. I can never remember what the S and R, I think it's repair, something repair and maintenance. Maybe one of you REM guys out there can
You might be
help me
getting
out.
help from a friend.
Yeah. Sorry. That's the reason I bring Sarah into these, so that she can ask me questions like that.
It's sustainment, restoration, and modernization.
There you go.
Thank you to Lieutenant Colonel Hughes.
Oh, Lieutenant Colonel Hughes. Okay, Michael. Yeah.
Oh.
Glad you could join us. Okay. Anyway, the bottom line is in the spreadsheet that I've got out on CMS right now, you can get down to this level. You can actually identify all the way down to outpatient cost versus inpatient costs in purchase care and pharmacy. What I will do once I get the opportunity to update a little bit more, I wanted to give you guys something to work with first, is add on those other pieces. It gets rather tedious because of the size of the file. Currently, the file that I have that I call the PMPM calculator that does all this behind the scene calculations, lookups, and whatnot is about 311 megabytes. So I can take pieces of this and put them out there, but to put the whole thing out on CMS, I think it's going to be better for us to finally get, now that we have it where we can work with it, we can give it to AMSR and they can load it into CMS as a metric that will give you the ability to go down to these levels. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but to relook at something that we had out there before. The scenario tool has been pulled, but it's being reworked with the new method incorporated, and hopefully we'll have that out no later than like the end of January is what I'm hoping to do. Yes.
Tony, I have two questions from the attendees. One is from Major Korwicki at Madigan, and she wants to know if inpatient costs from the DMEPRS code are included from the ICUs.
No. And maybe I should have explained that. If anything is stepped down in A and B, which are, well, I take that back. They are. Yes, I apologize. All the D codes and E codes are stepped down into the A and B determined on, which is determined by the MEPR system. It's not the best, as most of you are well aware, but it's what we have as a cost and it's not even a cost allocation, it's a expense allocation system, but it's what we have to use to track expenses.
Okay. Then the second question comes from Dr. Snedeker at Madigan also, and he wants to know if the costs are adjusted for inflation, because he says over several years that would make a difference.
Well, the costs aren't adjusted for inflation, but the target is. So Health Affairs TMA, they actually use I wanted to say that. They use Kaiser Permanente, their target, and they work with that, and there are some adjustments done on it, but each year we get a different target, and it is based mostly on inflation and other factors. Just to give you an example, FY12, the target was to keep the growth from first quarter one year to first quarter the next year, for example, below 9.2%. And FY13, it's now 3.5%. And the reason for that, I know it's pretty drastic, but it's because of the rates that they have looked at have gone down, and typically they factor in everybody. So the inflation, we don't factor it into our calculations, but it's factored into the target. Hopefully that answers your question.
It does, but they can't hear me when I'm talking, so when I ask you a question, you may have to repeat it so they can hear the question. I didn't know they couldn't hear me that well.
I'll repeat the question. The question from Dr. Snedeker was, is inflation factored into the PMPM calculation? And my answer was no, but it is part of the final product, which is, is your trend staying below a certain percent? And that percent is driven partially by inflation. Okay, I'm going to go from here into the next slide, which is the drivers. What I've done here, and I did this at the last minute, is the white boxes that you're looking at are going around from population in the left corner counterclockwise: population, institutional, which is inpatient, professional, pharmacy, ancillaries, and purchase care. Those are your components. The other boxes that you're looking at are big drivers of that. We don't really control population that much. We don't control purchase care, so those are drivers that we can't affect change on, except for managing your enrollees as far as market share. So you have cost per RWP and discharges per beneficiary per year. Those two together determine what your direct care inpatient cost is. If your costs are going up and your utilization is going up, your PMPM is going to go up. If you bring your costs down and your enrollees are not being discharged or admitted to the hospital, then your PMPM will go down. Same with professional. You've got the cost per SRVU and the utilization. Pharmacy is the same way. This is, even though pharmacy is a direct, what am I trying to say? It's not a calculated cost in the calculation. It is still something that you can affect change on, because there's ways to try and pull retail pharmacy back in, which is a big driver. And TMOP, not so much now, but TMOP has actually started going up and is almost at the level of retail, if I'm not correct about that. But what you really want to do here is, keep in mind that is an area that you can affect change. And then the ancillaries, of course, your RAD and lab, and it's a cost per RVUs and the utilization rate. Now, the yellow boxes are things that you can look at in order to try to affect change. They are sub-drivers is what I call them, or deep level drivers. So for population, you're looking at enrollees that are enrolled to MTF versus managed care support contract. We have a good example of a hospital that, and go unnamed, that had a huge population change in demographics. And part of the population that moved in ended up going to managed care support contractor rather than going into the MTF. And what they found themselves with was a large amount of civilian labor, but not the enrollees that they were expecting to get. Also, the change of population demographics. If you have a bunch of BCTs that are out there with a young population, and all of a sudden a couple of the BCTs go away, and you want to remain at the same level of effort, then you may want to pull retirees in. If that happens, then what happens is the demographics change the equivalent lives right there. You get a larger equivalent lives, which drives your PMPM down. Okay, and then going around, as you can read, there's a lot of it's common sense. Personnel hours per occupied bed day will do your cost per, affect your cost per RWP. Both cost per RWP and RVUs, how much is sent to the network, because the more you do in-house, the better off you are. Also, for I pretty much cover the pharmacy cost per script. It's where you're sending them to get, or where your enrollees are going to get their prescriptions filled. And then finally, for the ancillaries, the number of tests per provider per month, and you can also say the number of tests per enrollee per month. And this is an important area now that we have it stripped out, where you can look at the cost per on your RAD and lab, is to look at some of those providers that may be ordering multiple tests that may not be needed. That's just an example. I'm not accusing anybody of anything, but if that's happening, then your cost per RVU for radiology is going to go through the roof. So that's a quick look at the drivers. And to take it a step further, the next slide is showing you some of the tools, because PMPM, even when you have the scenario tool and the ability to calculate it, is not going to give you all the answers. Once you start the deep dive and you want to look at, well, why is my population changing? Is it going to change in the future, for example? Well, there's an enrollment capacity model and the enrollment-based station model that you can look at to kind of answer some of those questions. And as you go around counterclockwise, we have bed days per 1,000 for your institutional. The ACE affects the cost per and everything. Then the RVU per person per year, high utilizers, and you can read the rest. The only area that we don't have tools for right now is pharmacy and the ancillaries. And I forgot to add my other arrow. And that may be something that we're looking at. And I know that we will have the metrics added into the metrics section of CMS for the cost per script, as well as the cost per 30 days fill. That's part of what we want everybody to be able to look at, to be able to see what part of that may be driving their PMPM. Hopefully I'm not going too fast. So the way ahead, and this is really a look at where the PMPM is going. What our plan to do is, now that we have the new methodology and we have gone back and forth with Health Affairs and corrected several things within the calculation, and we're agreeing on our numbers being close as they're going to get. We'll be updating the data quarterly and also the methods as needed. And that's in the next paragraph. I'll explain that. And then we're, like I said, hopefully by the end of January, we'll be able to update and post a revised scenario tool. Now, the way ahead for MHS, there's several things here to take in, but these are the initiatives that are being implemented as we speak. It's just going to be a while before they're fully in there. Adjusting the data using ease. And this is real important because for the non-personnel costs, if you really need a rolling 12, what you'll see when you look at your data is you'll see bumps, especially if you do it by month. If you do it by quarter, you're still going to see a roller coaster. And the reason being is with your expense data that goes into the cost per, you see contracts that may be, final payment on them. You may have some expense that you have to let out on 1 month. The rolling 12 irons that out to where it's a smoother number to work with. And also we'll be able to get the current month for personnel costs rather than having to wait for 45 days when MEPRS updates. Also, we're looking at the possibility of adding some of the ancillary F codes, hearing conservation, some of those things that have been left out, and then once again it'd be allocated to the appropriate locations. There's an initiative to adjust for deploy period. What does that mean? Well, one of the things that we found in doing some deep dives is that utilization really is a key factor in driving the Army PMPM up. And that's because there are actually 3 areas that focus in on where we have a higher utilization than the other 2 services. The first one is mental health, PTSD, of course. And the other one, believe it or not, is ortho for lower back pain. And people kind of look at you and say, well, why is that? Well, the soldiers that are over there that are having to wear rucks or they're in a Humvee all day long, they're experiencing a large amount of lower back pain, and that's high utilization. But finally, the one that's really driving it is the pre and post deployment health assessments. And that goes into primary care, and what this is trying to do to adjust for the deploy periods, one thing is to get those out of the mix. So during the period of time, when we're looking at maybe 2 weeks before they deploy until 4 weeks after they get back, those enrollees will be taken out of the calculation completely. That does 2 things. It takes away the pre and post deployment health assessments, which is a area of high utilization, but it also takes out of the mix those enrollees that you might have that are in Afghanistan or Iraq that get injured so badly that they have to do a stopover at Walter Reed, let's say. Well, during that period of time, that whole time that they're at Walter Reed, they are going against your PMPM. This would take that out of the mix until they return to home station and re-enroll back, if you will. They would not be part of anybody's PMPM. And then finally, I mentioned this earlier, we are going to move to a new equivalent loss. That was the ASD actually let HP and FP know that was going to happen. And we're well on the way of that. What they're using is what they call Wakely Risk Assessment Model. It's a modified version that Kennel Associate and Contractor has worked with Health Affairs to come up with to look at the military population specifically. So what it would do is make adjustments according to clinical diagnosis. And some of the examples of that, it's not just the active duty population, but some examples for active duty population are amputees, TBI, those chronic conditions that cause their usage of the system to go way out of the roof. But it also affects some of our other end of the population where you have chronic conditions such as COPD and whatnot. So this is actually a good thing. It's something that Colonel Rob Goodman insisted on at a meeting one day, and it finally got up to the Assistant Secretary of Defense, and he said, let's do it. So hopefully that we'll see something out of that in the next couple of months. So my final slide is next steps.
Tony, may I interrupt you with two?
Sure.
Remember, they can't hear me.
Okay.
The first is to clarify the D code expenses, the MEPRS D, including ICU, are or are not included in their PMPM?
Okay, the question is, for clarification, are D MEPRs included in the PMPM? E and D both are stepped down into B and A. So those expenses aren't directly in the calculation, but they are part of the expenses that go in to calculating the cost per. So if you have someone in the ICU and that D is being stepped down into an A code, then the expenses that are generated there will go into the A expenses. Now, as far as what workload is generated in the ICU, if it's an RWP, it will show up as well, because generally those RWPs go back to the admitting clinic, if you would, not admitting clinic, but admitting service. I will get further clarification on exactly how that goes in, but my understanding, I know that ancillaries step down. That's the reason we take it out now, because now we're doing the RAD and lab separately. It's always been stepped down into, in the past, into the A and B codes.
Tony, maybe that's something we can discuss in greater detail at the follow-up on 3 January.
Okay.
And the second question is from a Dr. Melissa Glinner.
Okay.
She wants to know how PMPM affects her PBAM earnings. She said she understands it might not be a direct relationship, though.
Okay, the question is, how does PMPM affect PBAM? Right now, it does not. There have been a couple of attempts to try and work it into PBAM, but it's kind of a quirky thing, because what you have to do in order to work it into PBAM, as well as like performance planning, you have to set step goals. You can't just say just one goal, stay below this. Now you can, but most people want to do something differently, because the reimbursement for that, for doing good, would have to be determined. And it's most of the ones that I have seen that go outside of the actual workload are done that way. I hope that answers your question. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, the next steps for all of you out there, what I would recommend that you do is, like I said, we've hung the newest PMPM. It's called PMPM Summary, and it's in the frequently asked questions, the exact way to go about doing this. But basically, you'll want to pull that up, review your PMPM values by using the pull down in the pivot table. Compare the current quarter with the same quarter last year, and they'll show up that way. And it'll automatically generate a chart that's all this is annotated, named the different sheets that will show you. Then what you want to do is look for the big picture things. If you see a sharp increase in your PMPM, take a look at what's been going on around you. What's occurred at your installation that may be driving this? Have there been population changes? Like I said, did a couple of BCTs leave and a different population came in? Have you had increased hiring actions? That's a big driver. Civilian pay is a big driver. Have you had a lot of deployments and redeployments recently? Once again, utilization. So you determine and analyze those data sets that you can associate back with the things, such as looking at the equivalent lives. You can look at that currently. Look at the increased civilian labor. You'll have to go into the MEPRS data, and this is part of what I'm going to supply to you once I find a way to shrink it down small enough to go onto the CMS. But your analysts can do this, or those of you that are out there that are analysts, basically you pull your total expenses out of the MEPRS table in M2 or A's and take a look at the civilian and military labor and run a chart on those and see exactly what's going on with them. And then finally, something that's a little more difficult is enrollee utilization. What you'll need to do on this is you'll pull your amount of RVUs and RWPs on your enrollees and look to see whether or not, based on the data that you have, see if there's any spike or increase in utilization in any specific MEPRS code or product line. and then dive deeper into that. And finally, once you find what it is that you think is causing the change, then you need to formulate a plan of action so that you can affect change on the drivers. And this is the most difficult part, because I'm often asked here, well, what do we do specifically to change the PMPM? Well, it's going to be different at every MTF in every region. And that's because each of you out there have unique circumstances and unique populations, and all that goes into being a different MTF from each other. But we will be here to help you out with the rest of it. And like I said, our plans are to put more out there to help you understand. Eventually, once I can have some of the next few meetings with the analysts and explain to them in detail what goes into the calculation, then we can put the actual queries out there. The queries are really nothing to pull the M2 data. There's nothing to them. They're really basic type queries. It's when you pull it out and put it into Excel and start marrying up the data to do your cost per and then your direct care costs, that's where it gets tricky. So, and that's what we want to try and help the field understand. So, any final requests? Oh, what? I hadn't seen this one. Is this one yours?
That is. So, just a reminder. We have one webcam, so we're just going to keep switching seats. Just as a reminder, we have 3 final requests similar to the last Aspire series. So first is, please take our post-course survey and tell us how we did. Just like you saw if you attended the inpatient satisfaction course and follow-up, we take a lot of the questions and ideas that come from the pre- and post-course survey and address those in the follow-up. And I understand that this is a very complex subject. In fact, I've asked Tony to teach it to me like I'm a 3rd grader, and then again like I'm a 1st grader. So please don't be embarrassed if you too have questions. We're happy to go into more detail in the follow-up because there are a lot of nuances in this PMPM calculation. And if you formulate your questions ahead of time and put them in this post-course survey, it'll give Tony some lead time to answer it, and it'll give us some heads up that we'll address that first thing on the follow-up session. Speaking of follow-up session, we'll meet again on 3 January, right after the new year at 1300. We'll use this very same DCO room, and we'll discuss all of the questions that come through on the pre- and post-course survey, and we'll also present some of the initiatives that you've told us you're doing to begin to decrease your per member per month scores. And
Colonel Amaral asked, where can he find the calendar of the Aspire series?
That's a great question, Colonel Amaral. We're waiting for SharePoint to be updated we're expecting to get it mid-January. So once we have a good SharePoint site for this, that's where we'll put all of the course offerings. So for now, I'm kind of advertising them one-on-one. I apologize. We're a little slow in the technology game, but we'll soon have a calendar up, and we'll do a broad distribution until we get that calendar up. And maybe if you have some suggestions of alternatives we can use, I'm happy to take those as well. Finally, my 3rd request is tell us who from your facility or who that you know should be invited to the next Aspire Series course. That's going to be taught by Lieutenant Colonel Scott Davis on 10 January. And he'll walk us through OR utilization metrics and some strategies for improving our operating room utilization. Tracy, could you hit paste in the chat and put the URL in the chat as well? If you just hover over it and click paste, it's on my toolbar. That'll give you the web link for the post-course survey. Do we have any other questions from the chat?
No.
Right, please tell us how we did, and we certainly look forward to seeing you on 3 January. Happy holidays and Happy New Year. Thanks for attending.